Okay, today's video is all about the new Natasha Denona Golden Palette. I wanted to film two different looks for you, share some close-up shots, some swatches, some comparisons, and just share my thoughts on the palette, the quality, the formula, things like that. So this palette is available now for $69. You can get it at Ulta, Sephora, a couple of other retailers, and then of course from the Natasha Denona website. I did purchase this myself, but I do have an affiliate code. If you choose to shop from Natasha Denona's website, you can get 15% off. So if you use my code Andrea15, it will bring the price down to around $58. Like I said, I did buy this palette myself. Natasha Denona makes my favorite eyeshadow palettes. I don't buy all of them. It has to be a color story that's either really unique to my collection, like the Yucca palette, or it has to be something I'll use all the time, like I Need a Nude. So there are launches that I skip over, but I thought this palette was really beautiful. I love a good golden eyeshadow look. It's something that I tend to do like late summer, into fall, and then into the holiday season as well. And this color story just really jumped out at me. Now, this is based on her older gold palette, which was discontinued. I actually never tried that palette, so this video isn't going to be a comparison to the older palette and the similarities, the differences. I know there are other YouTubers who have uploaded something like that just based on the thumbnails I've seen. This video is just like a standalone review on this palette. I always thought that palette was really beautiful, but at the time I wasn't really into Natasha Denona. I didn't really start using the brand until she started launching her mid-sized palettes. I felt like the other ones were a little bit too big, a little bit too expensive. I do like the fact that that palette had some green tones in it as well, which I think created like a little bit more versatility within the palette. And with the newer version, she took those out and it is like a true neutral and gold palette. So I think for some people, it's like a step down from the original color story. I do have the Yucca palette and I feel like that will actually combine so perfectly with this new golden palette. And I wonder if that's why she took out like those green tones, because she does have a lot of shades like that in the Yucca palette. So those would be really complementary. So either way, that's just something I wanted to point out. It is based on that palette, but it's definitely more neutral. It doesn't have those pops of color. That might be a pro or a con for you. I feel like these days neutral palettes are very, very trendy, and I can definitely see why she wanted to kind of tone it down, but I do think they would have added to the color story too. So this palette does have a lot of similar shades from the original one. I'm not sure if the formulas have been updated, if they're better, if they're the exact same. Again, I would recommend watching a comparison video if that's what you're curious about, but this palette does come with 7 matte shadows. You get both the cream and the pressed powder matte formulas. There are 5 of her typical metallic shadows in the palette, and then there is a sparkling foiled champagne, a chroma crystal topper with a diamond-like finish, and then a golden nude wet effect formula. I do like Natasha Denona's matte shadows, but overall I tend to prefer her metallics, her shimmers, her wet shine effects. Like everything special that she does with those types of shadows is what I love on the eyes the most. So that's why I was excited for this one, because it did look to have a lot of really beautiful, sparkling, metallic, gorgeous shadows. As for the actual palette, this is a very neutral, very warm toned, very golden eyeshadow palette. If you don't like warm tones or neutrals or golds, this is not going to be the palette for you. I do feel like it will be a great complementary palette to other Natasha Denona palettes I own, like Yucca or Bronze, but I also kind of wonder, and in today's video, I did do two different looks, so you'll hear additional thoughts. I kind of wonder if there is enough versatility within this palette. There's one deeper shade right here. I feel like a lot of these matte shadows end up looking kind of similar on the eyes. So even though this is like such a golden palette, it's very, very warm toned. I almost feel like a couple of cooler tones in here would have balanced it out a little bit. But again, you can always reach into other palettes to create those types of looks. For today's video, I just wanted to use this palette. So the first look that I'll do for you is a little bit more golden, a little bit softer, and then I'll come back and show you how I got this look. Okay, so for the first look, I want to do something that I would probably go for on like an everyday basis. Something a little bit more toned down in terms of intensity, but also something really sparkly and pretty and just fun. So this one's going to be a little bit more simple. I'm going to start with the shade Flesh, which has a little bit of peachiness to it, and blend this into the crease as a transition color. I feel like there are a lot of good matte shadows in here that I would reach for really often, whether I was doing something super quick and easy, like one matte shadow in the crease and then a shimmer all over the lid, or maybe incorporating a couple of matte shadows. For the most part, it looks like the matte shadows in here are pretty light and soft, with the exception of the shade Log, which is a little bit deeper. I almost wish there was like one medium toned matte shadow to kind of create a nice transition from light to dark, but when I do the more dramatic look, we'll see how it goes. If you're new to my channel, sometimes I do experience a little bit of patchiness on the right eye because I am dealing with some texture on this eye. I feel like it just gets a little bit more noticeable as I get older. So I don't typically blame it on the eyeshadow unless it's doing the same thing on the other eye too. I'm not really having a hard time right now, but just something I want to point out. Okay, I'm going to do the right eye on camera and the left eye off camera just to save a little bit of time. I'm just going to take a little bit of this shade Panna, which this is a matte as well, but it has that cream to powder matte texture. So I like to use more of a stippling motion with this type of shadow. And if you do deal with texture on your eyelids like me, this is such a good formula because it just kind of smooths over the area. It has a matte finish, but because it has a little bit of creaminess to it, it's not the typical matte powder. It just creates like a very even finish. Next, I'm taking the shade Sandstone and blending that into the crease just to add a little bit more definition. And this is the regular powder matte formula. So it's blending really well. I mean, that's my experience with Natasha Denona matte shadows. Sometimes the deeper shades can be slightly more difficult to work with, and I can experience a little bit of patchiness, but that really never happens with the lighter shades, especially if I am creating like a little bit more of a gradient rather than just going directly in with the darker shade, which is why I do wish there was maybe one deeper, almost like a medium toned brown, which maybe the darker brown in here can be sheared out. We'll see as I do my next look, because I am going to use that in the outer corner to really darken things up. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of the shade Teak, which is slightly darker, and kind of focus this in the outer corner and then up into the crease. I definitely want to use as many shadows as possible today because it is my first time testing it out, but I will come back in a few days and do another look because I did order some other makeup that I want to try out, so I'll use this palette in that video too. All right, I think I'm going to take Cava, which is described as a sparkling champagne gold. I don't know if this would actually work better as a topper shadow, but I feel like it would be perfect all over the lid because it doesn't have a super rich base to it. It more so just gives like that sparkling foiled finish. And there are some really gorgeous, intense gold shadows in here, but I feel like for more of an everyday look, I just like something that's a little bit softer, but still really, really sparkly. So this is pretty because it's obviously very gold, but it doesn't have that rich yellow tone to it like the other golds in the palette do. You could definitely use a damp brush if you want like a really sparkly effect. That would definitely intensify this a little bit more. But to be honest with you, I never use a damp brush unless for some reason the shadows aren't working for me. I'm a little bit lazy. I can't be bothered to add that extra step in for when I'm doing my makeup normally. So I want to use this palette in the way that I would normally do my makeup just so I can give it like a true fair shot. Okay, I'm going to go over that with a little bit of Fizzy, which they describe as a sparkling wet effect golden nude. So I think both of these shadows are more so meant to be topper shadows, kind of layered alongside of the other metallics in the palette, even on top of some of the mattes if you want just like that light sparkling finish. But when Natasha Denona does like a sparkling shadow or she does something that has like a wet shine effect, those tend to be my most used shadows in the palette because they're just really beautiful on their own if you want like a little bit of translucency to the shadow, or again, if you want to layer them on top. Really pretty, really sparkly. My only concern with this palette is whether or not, I'm going to get a ton of different looks out of it. I feel like a lot of these gold shadows will probably end up looking kind of similar on the eyes. Today, when I'm doing the looks, I'm going to do two very different looks and we'll see how that goes. But I feel like day to day, if I'm using like one or two of these matte shadows and one or two of these sparkly shadows, a lot of the looks will probably look kind of repetitive. And that is the case for me with the bronze palette. I feel like this kind of reminds me of the bronze palette, but obviously very golden in tone. But the reason why I like that is because it flows so well. So no matter what I'm reaching for, I can create a very seamless look, but the looks do end up looking pretty similar in the end. I'm going to take the shade Sandstone and just run that on my lower lash line. There is a little bit of fallout from those sparkly shadows. Again, when I do tend to use one of her topper shadows, if I lay it on top of a creamy metallic, I don't usually experience a lot of fallout, but sometimes if I'm layering them on top of a lot of other matte shadows, I can. I'm going to go apply mascara, potentially nude liner in the waterline, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so I did apply the Tower 28 Make Waves mascara. I almost wish I went with brown mascara. I think that would have looked really pretty with the gold eyeshadow, and I think that will be one of my go-to summer looks. And then I do have an eyeliner on the waterline. It's the Too Faced Killer liner in the shade Killer Cashmere, which is like a light, bright nude. I'm just going to take a little bit of the lightest shadow in the palette and kind of run that along my brow bone. And again, I think this is kind of like that creamy matte formula. So almost like a little bit of a stippling motion would work better with this. And I feel like this type of shadow is so perfect. Again, if you deal with texture like me, like right along the brow bone, because it just kind of smooths and blurs the edges, especially if you don't have like the most even, if you didn't blend your eyeshadow as well right there, or like I said, if you're dealing with texture. Okay, so this is how the first look came together. I feel like I was actually able to use a good amount of the shadows in here. I used 2 of the matte creams, which I love. That was like the brow bone highlight, and then also the shade that I used to kind of go over the transition color just to smooth everything out. As for the regular matte shadows, I used 3 of them. They're very creamy, a little bit powdery, so I just recommend tapping off the excess. They build nicely. There was a little bit of patchiness with that shade Teak in this outer corner, but I'm going to blame that on the texture on my eyelid because I didn't have that issue over here. I think the shade Fizzy, which I applied right on top, is going to be the perfect topper for any metallic shadow in this palette. And I did experience a little bit of fallout, mainly with the shade Cava, but I think if I was to apply it on top of a metallic in the palette, it would have stuck a little bit better. Anyway, here's the first look. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's move on to the second one. Okay, moving on to look number 2. For this look, I want to go with a few more of the bronzy tones on the lid. There are a lot of golden eyeshadows in here, and I feel like in the end, the look is still going to come out somewhat golden, but I want to do something not quite so yellow gold, if that makes sense. So let's start with the shade Aria. At first glance, some of the shades in here do look a little bit cool toned, but I'm pretty sure when I swatched everything, that wasn't really the case. They all ended up coming out pretty warm. So I'm going to go for some of the shades that look a little bit cooler in the pan. I definitely didn't buy this palette expecting to get any cool toned looks out of it, but sometimes I'm not always in the mood for like a complete yellow golden eyeshadow look, but I still want like a gold effect. So that's what I'm going to kind of create for this look. I feel like a lot of the lighter matte shadows end up looking kind of similar on the eyes. So again, I feel like there could have been maybe a little bit more variety with the matte shadows in this palette. Again, I'm going to take like that brow bone highlight shade in here just to kind of smooth out the edges a little bit. I don't necessarily want to go as high with this transition color as I did last time. I'm going to keep it just a touch lower. And then again, I'm going to do the other eye off camera. I'm stuck because I almost feel like I need to take this teak shade in the crease because I want to use this in the outer corner, but I feel like going from this shade straight to this shade is asking for a little bit of a muddy look, but this might add a little more warmth than I kind of want. Let's start with the darker brown shade called Log. When I was swatching them, this shadow definitely swatched a little bit patchy. And I almost feel like that's going to be the case as I apply it to the eye too. I don't think it's going to go on well with like a sweeping motion in the crease. So what I'm going to do is really pack this on the outer corner just to add some depth. I actually pulled out all of the palettes that I wanted to compare to this one this morning, and I wanted to swatch them side by side before actually sitting down and using the palette just to see how the shadows felt next to other palettes I have in my collection. And I will say there are other dark browns that seem easier to use than this one. I don't know, as I'm kind of packing it on the outer corner, it doesn't look patchy like this, but I feel like if I go to blend out the edges a little bit, that's where I might experience a little bit of streakiness. Let's just see, because I guess that is the entire point of this video. I'm testing out the palette to see how it works. Again, just for personal preference, I would like a shade that kind of falls in between these two, but I've done looks before where I just kind of use the dark shadow as like the outer corner color, but also the crease shade too. So I guess that's what we'll go for in today's video. Just kind of lightly blending it into the crease, just like the very, very edges of it, because I really don't want to pull this color too high. This is the Sigma E35 tapered blending brush, and I'm just using that color Aria, which is what I used I actually used this as a transition shade with like a larger fluffy brush, so it created a little bit more of a diffused look. but I'm just taking it on this crease brush to kind of blend the outer corner up into the crease a little bit more. And then I'm basically just going to go back and forth between these two brushes and these two colors and just kind of work to blend them together. This is going to take a little bit longer. So again, not something I would do on like an everyday basis, but maybe more so for like a special occasion. I do like a good smoky eye, but it's probably something I tend to do more so in like the fall and winter rather than the spring and summertime. But I am curious to know like how dramatic this palette can go. So I'm just adding a little bit more in the outer corner. Okay, let me start to work on the other eye and then I'll kind of touch base and see where I'm at. Okay, now that I have the base down, I want to go in with a metallic. I'm kind of going back and forth between this one and this one. I think I'll actually layer them together. So let's start with this. Okay, so the first shade I'm going in with, Varus, is a metallic medium antique brass. And then the second shade I'm going to go in with, Nubia, is a sparkling foiled gold nude champagne. I'm reading directly from the Natasha Denona website, just so you know. I'm just kind of curious as to which shadows are which formulas since I haven't actually applied them to the eyes yet. So this is her traditional metallic formula. It's very creamy. There's not a ton of sparkle to this. It almost kind of leans like satin looking. Like you're not going to see a ton of reflection on the eyes, but I feel like it's a good base because it still keeps the drama on the lid, and then you can go over it with a more sparkly topper shadow. That's a really nice color. It definitely has that antique brass vibe, just like the description says, but I absolutely want to go over it with something a little bit more sparkly. Okay, I have high hopes for this shade because it looks so pretty in the pan, and I just feel like layered on top of these dark shadows, it's just going to make the look pop. Yeah, it's perfect. So again, this is obviously not a cool toned look, but I feel like it doesn't have the same intensity as the other one does in terms of like that yellow gold aspect, which I thought would end up being kind of what I would get out of every single look in this palette, but it's nice to know that you don't necessarily have to get that type of look. I feel like I was able to get a pretty dramatic look. I mean, if I didn't go in with this topper shadow, I could keep the lid even just a little bit darker, but I love a good like wet looking shiny lid, especially with like a deeper outer corner. I feel like it just makes everything pop a little bit more. I'm just going to take the shade Aria on the lower lash line. Ooh, that looks really warm now. Now that I kind of mix those shades for the top part of the look, a little bit too warm maybe. I'm just going to take the smallest amount of that shade Fog, which is the dark brown, and run that on my lower lash line too. Okay, I'm going to clean the look up, add a little bit of liquid liner and mascara, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I used the same mascara, the Tower 28 Make Waves. The liquid liner is from One Size, and then I do have a little bit of the Urban Decay 24/7 Glide On Eye Pencil in the shade Smog on my waterline. So that's everything I did off camera. So again, to finish off this look, I'm just going to take the lightest shade in here, that like creamy matte shadow, and just blend this on the brow bone and just along the sides of the, you know what? I should be able to do this by now, be able to talk and do my makeup at the same time. Sometimes it just doesn't flow like that. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. I'm just using this to kind of blend out the edges a little bit. And then I am going to add an inner corner highlight to this look. I didn't do that last time. I'm going to take the shade Aura, which when I first saw it in the palette, I was like, oh, that's an interesting choice because it kind of looks like an icy silver. It has like a very white base to it, but then when I swatched it, it had a golden sheen. How do they describe this one? This one is a metallic golden ivory. Interesting, because it doesn't really feel like her typical metallic formula. I guess it does. It's like a little bit thicker, but again, it has like that translucent base to it. So I feel like it would be a good option to layer on top of other shadows just to really brighten them up and kind of add that icy effect with like a golden touch. Anyway, I do like how this look came together. I have to say, even though that dark brown matte shadow did not swatch well at all, it actually went on the eyes really nicely. Like if you're going to use a brush, which one did I use? The Sigma E24 Diffused Blend, which I mean, I think this is perfect for this type of look because you can really pack it on and then kind of turn it and blend it into the outer corner. It actually performed performed a lot better than I thought it was going to initially. So as for everything else, Aria is that shade I used in the transition or in the crease, and then also as a transition, it blended out well. This metallic went on nicely. I really like the shade Nubia. I think it looks so gorgeous, just really pretty on the eyes. And I'm curious to wear that with just like one matte shadow in the crease because I feel like it will add a lot to the look, but I almost like it on top of the dark shadows just to add like some bright touches to the eyes. So I'm impressed by everything so far. Let me kind of gather my thoughts together and then I'll come back and wrap up this video and I guess start the video because I don't think I actually filmed an intro. So after using the palette to create the two different looks, I definitely think the quality is there. I'm really familiar with Natasha Denona palettes because, like I said in the beginning, she does make my favorite formula. I'm pretty impressed by everything that I used in today's video. But again, I do think that you're probably going to end up with a somewhat similar look the majority of the time. Even though I was able to get two kind of different looks in today's video, I feel like most of them will fall into the category of the first look, which pulls very gold, very warm toned. So if you're looking at this palette trying to decide if you want to buy it, I would ask yourself how often you wear golden eyeshadow looks. If the answer is really often, then I do think you would get a lot of use out of this, but you might also have quite a few gold palettes in your collection. If you're someone who doesn't tend to reach for these shades a whole lot, it might be a better option to go with a less expensive version and then splurge on a different Natasha Denona palette that has a color story similar to what you like to wear a little bit more often. Let's finish up the video with a couple of comparisons. So I want to start with the palettes that I think are the most similar, and then I'll talk about some palettes that I initially thought would be similar, but I actually think are quite a bit different. So the first palette that I think would make a really good alternative is the Urban Decay Naked Honey. Now this is an older eyeshadow palette, so there is a chance that you already have this in your collection and you just haven't used it in a little while. And I do feel like there are quite a few shades in here that are pretty similar. When I swatched them side by side, I found 8 that I felt like were pretty close. They might not necessarily be spot on dupes, but if you were to apply them to the eyes, I feel like you would end up getting a very similar look. This palette has some more like orangey warm tones in it than this palette does, so it just kind of depends on what you're going for. But I will say the Urban Decay formula isn't quite as rich or pigmented as Natasha Denona, and the metallics in Natasha Denona, in my opinion, are a lot better than Urban Decay. Urban Decay's matte shadows are a little bit more approachable because they're very blendable, they're easy to build up, and Natasha Denona's matte shadows are a little bit more pigmented, so they can be slightly more difficult to work with if you're not used to it. But in the end, if you do have the Naked Honey palette, I feel like you could get some very, very similar looks, especially if you were willing to pull in like a couple of other shadows in your collection. This one actually surprised me because I did not expect it to be similar really at all, but this is the ColourPop Going Coconuts. When I look at this, obviously like on first glance, it doesn't really look anything like Natasha Denona's Golden palette, but there were quite a few shades in here that I felt like came very, very close when I swatched them side by side. Obviously, this one is a lot more warm toned and this one is more neutral, so it's more toned down and you don't get like those bright, vibrant golden tones. But if you were to take out like those two really gold, bright yellow shades from this palette, you would end up with a somewhat similar color story. So it's slightly more toned down, but if you do have this, again, I feel like there are some similarities between the two. Actually, same thing with I Need a Nude. This palette is a little bit old. I have loved this palette for such a long time. I think this one comes a little bit closer because you do get some of those warmer orangey tones in here. Again, this is missing like those bright, vibrant yellow gold shades, and I feel like that's kind of what really complements the other tones in here. But if you have those from another palette or you aren't as interested in them, again, you could end up getting something very, very close with this palette right here. Okay, this is the ColourPop Precious Metals palette. Obviously, it comes with quite a few more shades, I think like double the shades as Natasha Denona, but you do get a lot of warm tones and cool tones in here. So again, not necessarily a ton of exact matches between the two, but a very, very similar vibe if you were going for like the first row, the second row, even some shades from the third and fourth and fifth rows. I will say the metallics in here probably come the closest, and ColourPop did step it up with this palette. Sometimes their quality can be a little bit hit and miss, but the metallics in here are very rich, super vibrant. I will say there are a few other ColourPop palettes that kind of popped into mind when I was thinking of similar palettes to the Natasha Denona one, but I don't have them. There was like a golden palette that's been discontinued. They also have like a golden sunset palette available on their website that might be close. So if you do like ColourPop's formula or you already own from those, I would maybe look up some swatches to see if they are close enough. A few other palettes that I actually didn't find very similar at all. The Makeup by Mario Ethereal Eyes. I feel like the shimmer shadows in here might give a similar effect, but the formulas are very, very different. And the actual tones don't really come that close when it comes down to it. So I kind of thought of that one, but it wasn't as close as I originally thought. The Tarte Maneater palette definitely has like the warm tones down. And again, you get a little bit more variety in here. I feel like some of the metallics give a very similar effect on the eyes, but I would say the matte shadows don't really match up quite as well as I thought they would. And this one has like a lot of berry tones in it too. Again, you might be able to get a similar effect if you pull in another ColourPop palette and mix it with this, but on its own, I don't find it similar enough. The Patrick Ta Major Dimension 1 is kind of like one of my go-to warm toned eyeshadow palettes. This is missing a lot of gold shades in it. The tones really just don't match up between the two of these. There might be like one or two shades that end up looking somewhat similar on the eyes, but I definitely get a very different look when I use this palette compared to Natasha Denona. The last one is the Too Faced Born This Way Natural Nudes. I will say the metallic formula in this palette probably looks the closest to Natasha Denona out of everything else that I've mentioned, with the exception of the ColourPop Precious Metals palette. So there are a couple of shades in here that I feel like could end up looking somewhat similar on the eyes, but for the most part, they really aren't the same color story. This one has like a lot of pinky tones. I hope that was helpful to see the palettes that I thought were the most similar, as well as the palettes that I didn't find to be quite as close. But in the end, if you have a lot of eyeshadow palettes in your collection, there might not necessarily be one palette that looks almost identical to this, but if you pull out 2 or 3 palettes, you probably could create very similar looks, because when it comes down to it, the Golden palette is definitely a gorgeous palette, but there aren't necessarily any super unique, amazing, spectacular shades in here that I feel like can't be duped with other palettes in your collection. It's not that the color story is the most unique color story by any means. It's just that Natasha Denona's formula is really beautiful. Some people find it very overrated, which I totally understand, but I think she does shimmers, metallics, foiled shadows so well. And when it comes to doing them in like golds and champagnes and those types of tones, I just think they look extra nice on the eyes. So I definitely will be able to get a lot of use out of this. I think it is a stunning palette. I personally can't wait to incorporate it into more looks, but I don't necessarily think this is going to be a must-have for every single person out there. It is a beautiful palette. The quality is definitely there. I really didn't have any issues with it overall. I want to keep using it over the next few days, and I'll come back and share an update with you. And of course, I'll use it in an upcoming video alongside of the Yucca palette. But those are my initial thoughts. So I hope this video was helpful. Let me know in the comment section below if you picked this palette up, if you plan on trying it out. I will link it in the description box below. Thanks again for watching today's video, and I'll see you very soon with a new one. Bye.